Why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Did you ever imagine being respawned and born right in the middle of Cairo and then having to actually live your life there? Well, let me tell you why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Birth and early childhood. If you were born in ancient Egypt, the first gamble you faced was simply surviving the day you entered the world. Infant mortality was brutal. Somewhere between 1 in 5 and maybe even half of babies never made it past their first birthday. And mothers weren't safe either, since childbirth came without doctors, C-sections, or any kind of pain relief. Your best hope was a couple of midwives, a few prayers, and maybe a protective goddess like Isis or Hecate looking out for you. The way birth happened back then looked very different from what we imagine today. Forget hospital beds. Egyptian women usually squatted to deliver, sometimes supported by 2 helpers. Once you were out, you got washed off, laid on a pile of cushions or even bricks, and your cord was cut with a reed knife. If your mom made it through, breastfeeding was the plan. But if she didn't survive or she was too weak, things got very difficult. Wet nursing was a thing back then too, where another woman would feed the baby with her own milk. It was sort of like hiring a nanny today, except it was about keeping the baby alive, not about convenience. But not every family could find someone willing or able to do it, and that meant many babies had little chance. Meanwhile, once children stopped drinking milk, they mostly ate bread and beer or gruel. And before you imagine a toddler with a pint glass, this was more like a thick, sour porridge with a little alcohol. The alcohol actually made it safer than plain Nile water, which was full of parasites. Still, the diet was heavy on bread and very light on fruits and vegetables, so kids often ended up weak and sick. A modern child dropped into this world wouldn't stand a chance. No immunity, no snacks, no clean water, and constant labor. The reality is that you probably wouldn't even make it through your first years, and if you did somehow manage to survive, by the time you turned 9, the real hard work was only just beginning. Late childhood to early teens, 9 to 14. So let's say you beat the odds and you're now around 9 years old. Life doesn't suddenly get easier. It actually gets tougher. At this age, kids were expected to join the family workforce in a serious way. That meant long days hauling water, grinding grain by hand, feeding animals, or helping in the fields with planting and harvesting. And we're talking about 10 to 12 hours under the blazing Egyptian sun with no snack breaks or juice boxes waiting for you. Education was a dream most never saw. Less than 10% of the population could read or write, and that was usually boys from wealthy families who were sent to scribe school. Scribe school was basically the training ground for future record keepers, where kids learned to copy texts on scraps of pottery and practiced endless handwriting drills. And it was strict, with punishments if you messed up. Most kids never went at all, and instead spent their days working to help the household survive. Even young kids were hauling water, tending goats, and watching siblings. However, the environment itself was a daily threat. Although the Nile is the main source of water for drinking and laundry, it was also a giant danger zone, with crocodiles, hippos, and parasites waiting to ruin your day. Add in heat over 100 degrees, scorpion stings, and endless lice, and honestly, every trip to the river was basically a gamble, especially for a kid. Food wasn't guaranteed either. When the Nile floods failed, crops died, and families went hungry. Kids were often the first to suffer, getting weaker and more vulnerable to diseases like diarrhea, fevers, and parasites. Compared to a modern childhood filled with school, sports, and free time, this stage of life in Egypt was all about hard labor and staying alive. And if you think that sounds bad, wait until you see what came next as teenagers moved into apprenticeships and even harsher responsibilities. But before we move to the next section, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this trip through ancient misery. Adolescence and apprenticeship, 15 to 20. By the time you hit your teenage years in Egypt, you weren't considered a kid anymore. Now, it was about picking up a skill and pulling your weight in the adult world. Boys often went into farming or picked up trades like pottery, carpentry, or metalwork, while girls were expected to run households and prepare for marriage. Apprenticeships were less like school and more like being thrown straight into work, learning directly from an older master, usually a family member. And accidents were common. Sharp tools, heavy loads, and long hours meant injuries like cuts, broken bones, or bad backs started young. Meanwhile, there was also something called corvée labor, which was basically forced community service owed to the state. Teens and adults were sent off to dig canals, quarry stone, or build temples during the flood season when farming was impossible. Living conditions at these work camps were terrible. Simple huts, little food beyond bread and beer, and poor hygiene. Disease spreads quickly, and punishments for slacking off could be harsh. Lashes or even threats to your family if you didn't pull your weight. Social rules kept teens in line as well. Boys gained some freedom outside the home, but were still expected to work nonstop, while girls were locked into domestic roles with little choice. Life was about discipline, duty, and obedience. And if you think high school rules are strict, imagine being whipped for not grinding enough grain. For a modern teenager, this stage would be a nightmare. You'd go from worrying about exams and sports practice to hauling stone blocks or sewing endlessly in a hot mud brick house. With no safety gear, no real medical care, and no freedom, most modern teens would crash under the weight of it all. What, surviving your teenage years in Egypt meant grit, endurance, and a lot of luck. Things many of us today probably wouldn't have. And once you reached your 20s, the grind of full-time adult work and family life was waiting for you. Young adult work and home. Reaching your 20s in ancient Egypt didn't mean freedom. It meant stepping into the long haul of adult life. From this age on, you were expected to work every day in your chosen role and keep doing it for the rest of your years. Most people were farmers, bending under the hot sun for long hours, while others became artisans shaping pottery, carving wood, or working with metal. A lucky few became scribes or priests, but even those jobs were exhausting in their own way. Workshops were stuffy mud brick rooms with almost no airflow, making every day feel like summer inside an oven. Home wasn't much of a break either. Most families lived in simple mud brick houses with flat roofs and only a few pieces of furniture. There was no clean running water, no refrigeration, and food spoiled quickly. Water had to be hauled from wells or straight from the Nile, which meant you were always one sip away from catching some nasty parasite. Bathing was done in river water or shared basins, which sounds fine until you realize the same water was also used for laundry and waste. The food was plain and repetitive. Bread and beer made up most of the diet, with beers still serving as a daily staple. The bread was made from coarse emmer wheat, full of grit that slowly ground down people's teeth until decay and pain were part of normal life. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and meat were rare unless you were wealthy, so nutrition was often lacking. For women, young adulthood usually meant marriage and children, and that came with terrifying risks. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women thanks to infection, hemorrhage, and the lack of medical care. And because families wanted lots of kids, women often went through this danger again and again. Between the endless work, dangerous food and water, and high risks of disease, being an adult in Egypt was less about living life and more about surviving it. And just when you thought you had adjusted, sickness and injuries reminded you that even the best workers weren't safe, which brings us straight to the question of health and medicine. Health and medicine. The Nile gave water, but also spread parasites like schistosomiasis, along with malaria, lice, and endless stomach bugs. Most people lived with chronic illness, and sanitation was almost non-existent. Still, Egyptian medicine was impressive for its time. Doctors could fix broken bones, stitch up wounds, and even perform dental work. Remedies used everyday ingredients like honey for infections, willow bark for pain, and garlic as a natural antibiotic. But every treatment was usually mixed with prayers and spells, because medicine and magic were seen as one. The limits were obvious, though. Without clean water or antibiotics, many injuries and diseases were deadly. Even the best surgeons couldn't stop epidemics. A modern person dropped into this system would be shocked at how advanced it looked for the time, yet how helpless it would feel compared to today's hospitals. And health wasn't just about fixing the sick. It shaped how Egyptians saw order and purity in daily life. Which brings us to the bigger force that ruled everything: religion and ritual. Religion, ritual, and social control. Religion was the glue that held society together. The big gods like Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus weren't distant figures. They were part of daily life, and people believed the entire world depended on keeping them satisfied. The idea of Ma'at, meaning balance and order, was at the heart of it all. Pharaohs were seen as divine managers of that cosmic balance. Temples were everywhere, and they weren't just for prayer. They acted like giant religious corporations, running land, storing wealth, and feeding thousands of people. Priests performed daily rituals like bathing and dressing statues of the gods, offering food and burning incense. The offerings didn't go to waste. The priests and temple staff ate them afterward. But religion was also about control. Rules about purity shaped everything from what you ate to how you dressed and when you could enter a temple. Breaking those rules or ignoring customs wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. People believed it could upset the gods or even throw the world out of balance. For a modern visitor, not knowing these taboos could quickly land you in trouble. Death rituals made this even clearer. Egyptians believed in a detailed afterlife where your heart was weighed against the feather of Mat. To prepare, bodies were mummified, organs carefully removed, and tombs filled with spells, amulets, and offerings. The process could last months, and how elaborate it was depended on your social status. To us today, this constant ritual might feel overwhelming, but back then, religion gave structure, purpose, and authority, and without respecting it, you wouldn't last long in their world. Now let's move on to the final part of this journey through ancient Egypt, the military and war. Military service and war. Military service in New Kingdom Egypt was no small thing. Every able-bodied man could be drafted, and the pharaoh himself was seen as commander-in-chief. The army was split into huge divisions named after gods like Amun and Ra, each numbering thousands of men. Most new recruits joined the infantry, carrying spears, bows, or axes, while the elite charioteers sped across the battlefield with speed and precision. A select few even guarded the king directly as the Braves of the King. Training often started young, but formal service began around age 20. Recruits had their heads shaved and were given simple gear: leather armor, wooden shields, and weapons ranging from daggers to long spears. There were also special teams trained for siege work, scouting, or digging trenches. But none of this meant soldiers were well protected. Many marched into battle with little armor and huge risks. Life on campaign was grueling. Soldiers marched for miles across desert heat or rough terrain, carrying heavy loads with little more than bread and beer to keep them going. Injuries were constant: cuts, fractures, or infections that could turn deadly without proper care. And on the front lines, mortality rates were high, especially for regular foot soldiers. Of course, there were incentives. Victorious soldiers could win land, plunder, or even a promotion in rank. Military success brought status and sometimes lifelong rewards for a soldier's family, but it all came at the cost of strict discipline, harsh punishments, and constant danger. For a modern person, being thrown into this army would be a nightmare. You'd need to learn multiple weapons quickly, march for days without rest, and face battles without modern gear or medical care. The physical strain, the strict rules, and the trauma of ancient combat would break most of us long before the enemy ever got close. And with that, we've reached the end of this journey. If you enjoyed exploring it with me, make sure to subscribe so you're ready for the next adventure.